afraid of the dark.
Last year, I took a road trip to visit a couple of friends I studied with in high school. They moved to the city of Berkeley to study at the University of California, and I have visited them every summer since then, spending that time with them. Since we have studied together since high school, we are practically like brothers. We usually travel by plane, but last year we drove because there were a few parks, museums, and historic sites along the way that we really wanted to visit. The whole trip would have taken several days, so I wanted to make the most of my time. The first 2 days of the trip went very well and were completely normal, but on the third day I thought I would have reached my destination, but instead I was still driving at midnight. At this point, it was probably between 9-10 p.m. The roads were very quiet and there wasn't much traffic. I was very comfortable, although a little apprehensive, as I am a little uncomfortable on desolate roads. We still had a few hours to go, and I was eager to get to my friend's house as soon as possible, but I needed to go to the bathroom, get a cup of coffee, and wake up a little. So I stopped at the next exit at a roadside rest stop. Unlike the larger rest stops that had a truck parking lot and a gas station adjacent to it, this one was much smaller. This was just a small building with a row of parking spaces in front of it, but I didn't need more than that, so it suited me fine. As soon as I arrived, I noticed that it was quite dark and empty. I had been driving for several hours and my muscles were starting to go numb. I walked into the building and looked around. There was a janitor's closet and a men's restroom in one hallway and a women's restroom in the other. There were also several vending machines and a rack of magazines. I looked at one of the vending machines, looking for something to drink, an energy drink. I thought it a little odd why they would park right next to my car when there were other available spaces. I tried not to think big and went to the bathroom, did what I had to do, and came out about 5 minutes later. And when I came out about 5 minutes later, the car was still parked right next to my car and the lights were on, so it looked like the driver was still inside. This made me wonder what the driver was doing, but overall it didn't seem like much of a problem. So I looked around and turned my attention to the vending machine. I decided to buy a Red Bull, and as I sipped it, I couldn't help but look at the car next to me. For some reason, I didn't like what I saw. I looked back at my car and saw that the car next to me was still running. I started to walk away to get out, but just a few feet from the door, I heard the car's engine cut out. A second later, the driver's door opened and out stepped a tall, bearded man wearing a brown leather jacket with his hands in his pockets. I stopped near the door, and the man began to walk toward me. Suddenly, I felt my body fill with tension, and I had a bad feeling about this man. However, I remained calm and composed, but I was actually quite nervous, especially because his eyes were staring at me and looked really malicious. With only a few meters to go, I pulled away from the door and started walking in the direction of my car. I nodded hello, and he did the same. I turned around to see the muzzle of a 9mm pistol pointed at my face and an eerie smile on my face. "Why are you in such a hurry?" he asked me, struggling to control his breathing, which was getting faster and faster. I raised my hands to show I wasn't resisting and asked him what he wanted, to which he simply replied, "Give me your watch, your wallet, and your cell phone." I thought that was all I needed and complied with his demands nonchalantly, thinking that he would let me go. After giving him everything he requested, he motioned with his head for me to accompany him. Instead of entering the store, however, he walked me to the back where the woods were, and we entered them. And at that moment, my heart pounded. I was sure that if he would only take it from me, he would let me go, but he did not. He led me into this forest. For some reason, I was convinced he wanted to kill me. As I walked towards the place, I asked him why he was taking me there, and he told me to just walk. I was really scared and begged him to let me go. I told him to take my car if he wanted, but he didn't say anything. After walking about 15 or 20 meters through the woods, he stopped and told me to turn around. I did as he asked, and we came face to face. It was only about 2 meters from me. Then he pointed a gun at my face. I was going to die in the woods in the middle of nowhere. All I could think about was their pain when the news reached them. At that moment, I felt tears streaming down my face and my whole body trembling. He told me to kneel, and I did. I knelt down, knowing that this was the last moment of my life. I closed my eyes tightly and waited to be shot. And then it happened. Bang, bang, bang. 3 shots in rapid succession. I covered my ears with my hands and screamed with each shot. I thought I was dead, but I felt nothing. No pain, no signs of injury. I just felt the most intense fear I had ever experienced in my life. The fear that I could feel in my bones. Then I heard him laugh. It was as if he had just told me the funniest joke in the world. And then, as I was still lying on the ground crying and frightened, he said, "You know what?" Then he laughed and walked away as if nothing had happened. I touched myself looking for wounds, but there were none. Then I realized that he had not shot me. Words cannot describe what I felt at that moment. It was a mixture of fear, joy at being alive and unharmed, and a deep sense of humiliation. It was a mixture of emotions that I could not process. So I remained there for several minutes, listening to the sound of the man's car engine starting and driving away. Only then did I summon the strength to get up and walk back to my car. But before I could do that, I returned to the building and washed my face in the bathroom. Looking in the mirror, I realized that my condition was terrible. My face was red, swollen, and covered in a sticky mixture of tears and mucus. I was grateful to be alive, but at the same time I felt deeply humiliated and disheartened. My body was still shaking uncontrollably, but I suppose I was still in some sort of nervous shock. A few minutes later, I left the store and drove to a nearby town. There I borrowed a phone and called the police. Later that day, I told the officer what had happened to me and gave him a detailed description of the man. That night, I rented a room in that town and spent the night there. And the next day, feeling a little better, I went on my way. But instead of stopping anywhere, I drove straight to my friend's house. There I told them what had happened to me. I couldn't even believe how close I came to dying that night. I stayed at my friend's house for 2 weeks, as I do every year. During that time, I tried to act as calm as possible, but deep down inside I was very shocked, and that shock didn't go away for months. And even now, when I look back on that experience, I experience again the same emotions that overwhelmed me that day. I knew nothing about the man who was robbed and almost killed, so I don't know if they were able to catch him, or if he is still terrorizing people. And I just went on with my life. But yes, I never stopped at a rest stop since. Hello, my name is Dan and I drive trucks for a living for over 25 years. What I am going to tell you today happened about 4 years ago, and it was an event that will mark my life forever. On a rainy night, I was driving a huge truck down the highway. It was 4 in the morning and I had only 4 hours to get to the warehouse of the company to which I was delivering industrial supplies when I was hit by a torrential downpour that seemed to come out of nowhere. And this made for poor visibility on the road. But I have been in this profession for many years and am used to driving in these conditions and for long periods of time. But it was not only the downpour that made me uncomfortable that night. For some reason, a strange restlessness began to take over my body as we entered the last section. I could not explain exactly what it was. I just knew something was off. Maybe it was the eerie silence. Maybe it was the hours of driving without a break. And what was certain was that I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to push it away with music playing on the radio, which certainly distracted me a bit. But the strange restlessness did not go away. Despite the poor visibility, I continued to drive, but slowed down to ensure maneuverability in case of unforeseen circumstances. I always do that when driving in the rain. However, a few kilometers ahead, something unexpected happened. The fog was getting thicker, and the rain was still falling heavily. In through the fog, however, I could see the lights of a car coming toward me at full speed from the opposite direction. The fog was so thick that I could not see it until it was right above my truck. I quickly and reflexively swerved to avoid it just in time, but in doing so, the moisture on the road made it impossible for me to regain control of my truck. And no matter how hard I tried to stabilize it, I overturned violently and spun off the road. The last thing I remember was the feeling of weightlessness as the truck spun and the rasping sound of the pan as it rolled over. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, everything a blur. My head throbbed, my body felt heavy, and I tried to move but could not. It was shocked and crippled. I tried to remember what had happened. Eventually, everything came back to me. The car ramming into me, the truck trying to turn right, the truck overturning, the noise, the shock, the pain. And now I was lying in the middle of nowhere, injured and alone. Then I tried to call for help, but my voice was so weak. I could barely speak. I was trapped in the rubble, not knowing how long I would survive. As I lay there, struggling to open my eyes, I tried to call out for help as loudly as I could with what strength I had left, but to no avail. Moments later, an older man and a younger man approached me. They were father and son. They helped me and called an ambulance. From time to time, I felt my consciousness fading, but I held on as long as I could, knowing that help was on the way. Finally, the ambulance arrived and took me to the hospital. I remember the doctor telling me that I had several broken bones, internal bleeding, and a serious head injury. They also told me I was lucky to be alive. I couldn't believe it. I had been in a near-fatal accident from which I had no idea how I would recover, or if I would ever really recover. According to the doctor's diagnosis, this may have been my last moment on Earth. Fortunately, I did not die, but the recovery process was so torturous that at times I wished I had. Days turned into weeks and I was still in the hospital trying to heal my injuries. I could not move and was completely dependent on the nurses and doctors. I had never felt so helpless in my life. But as the days went by, I began to notice strange things happening around me. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and feel as if someone was watching me. At first, I thought it was due to brain damage or some other injury. But as it repeated itself, I began to think something was wrong. One night, while lying in my hospital bed, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a tall, dark figure, but I could not make out its features. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. Meanwhile, the figure began to approach me. I tried to move, but could not. It was just hopeless and terrifying. The figure came closer, and cold breath was on my face. I closed my eyes tightly and began to pray. I was so scared that I could feel my heart pounding. I did so for several minutes until I opened my eyes. And then I realized he was gone. I couldn't sleep for the rest of that night. When the nurses came in the morning, I told them what had happened, and they said, "It's just sleep paralysis, he's just a little boy." But I didn't think so. I was convinced that what I saw was completely real and not a hallucination like they wanted to show me. From that day on, I began to see them frequently, at all times of the day, everywhere. You might think I would have gotten used to it as the days went by, but I did not. Every time I saw it, I was terrified and almost went crazy, but I never said anything about it again. On the contrary, I was somewhat convinced that this figure had something to do with the accident, so I started looking it up on the internet. It was then that I learned that there had been a number of accidents similar to mine on that road, and many of the victims said they had experienced strange events. Some said they saw the lights of a car that was ramming into them, while others said they saw a shadow of a person in the middle of the road and then the accident happened. At that moment, I knew I was not alone in my experience. And that shadow, which seemed to haunt me day and night, was the cause of my accident. I was scared, but I was also angry. I wanted to know why this had happened. I wanted to know who or what that figure was, and why it was following me. But first I had to be sure that it was really him. The man who had stopped to help me that day with my son, his name was William. He took me to the hospital and told my family. And before he left me his phone number, telling me that I could count on him if I needed anything. And I couldn't be more grateful. He and his son were my guardian angels that night. But then I remembered that he arrived on the scene almost immediately. That meant he was coming very close to me when it all happened. This meant that he must have also seen the car coming at full speed in the opposite direction. Later that afternoon, I called him and asked him about it, and his answer confirmed what I had already suspected. In other words, he had not seen the other car. He said he was driving a few meters behind my truck at the time of the accident. Suddenly, he noticed that the truck suddenly turned left, began zigzagging, and finally went off the road and began to spin. He assured me, however, that there were no cars driving in the opposite direction, and in fact, he said, no other cars passed until the ambulance arrived. I had already suspected that something like this had really happened to me, and the fact that William proved it sent chills down my spine. This shadow ghost, or whatever it was, had nearly killed me, as had happened to several drivers who had encountered ghosts in ghost cars before me. But the strangest thing happened that same night. Later that same day, around 11 p.m., The figure appeared again at the foot of my bed. Again, it began to approach until it was positioned next to me. This time, however, it did not disappear, but began to whisper words to me. It began to tell me a story. He was a truck driver who had been killed in an accident on that road many years before. He told me that he was driving his truck in the middle of the night, just as dark and rainy as that night, when suddenly out of nowhere, an oncoming car came along. But unlike me, he could not avoid it. So they collided head-on and no one survived. I froze, and just as I was about to ask him who he was, a nurse came through the door and gave me the treatment for the night. That was the last time that figure appeared before me. I never saw her again. The next day I began researching accidents in the area. After several hours of searching, I came across a news story from 35 years ago. There was a fatal accident on that highway where the driver of a sedan car, who had been drinking, drove the wrong way on the highway and collided head-on with a freight truck. Both drivers then promptly lost their lives. However, no details about the drivers involved in the accident have been revealed. When I saw this news, I realized that that night, it was not really the spirit of the truck driver who caused my accident, as I thought, but the spirit of the driver of the other car. But what I found saddest of all is the fact that probably these two souls were trapped in that moment, unable to transcend. Since then, every chance I get, I say a prayer for both of them, that they may finally find their way to eternal rest.